Hi, I'm Gerry Conway, and I'm in the garden.
Let's explore creative minds at the panel garden. See what blooms, see what we find at the panel garden. Comics, cartoons, from old and new, nerdy papes, writers, editors, and art. Picking all their minds apart. With evil web as adorable as it gets.
Awesome.
Right.
So, am I pronouncing your name correctly as Gerry? I wasn't sure if it was Gerry or Gary.
Gerry.
Awesome. I've only ever seen it in print, so.
I have the same problem with a number of words that I read in comics as an adolescent that I'd never heard pronounced in my life. So I pronounced invulnerable as invernable for years.
For me, it was, I would say paradigm for the longest time, for like 20 years, and nobody ever corrected me.
or banal, which I
Yeah, there you
pronounced
go.
banal. Yeah, I have no
I
idea.
did the same thing.
Yeah.
Okay. So normally towards the middle of the interview, I usually ask writers about their thoughts on inclusivity and representation, but you've talked about this a lot over the years, and you have a great actual track record with putting it in your comics, and I think your perspective is interesting. Would it be okay if we started there?
I guess I guess my feelings about inclusivity and diversity and similar issues derive from my own sense of being an outsider when I first came into comics. And that was primarily because I was a kid, and as a kid, I was surrounded by people who were 5 or 6 years older than me. So that was the first sense of being an outsider. The second was I wasn't as educated as they were because I was much younger, so I didn't have the education. I was also an outsider in a kind of an ethnic sense. People like Irish Catholic kids weren't very prominent. There was basically me, Denny O'Neil, and Neil Adams, and we were it. Everybody else that we knew was either Jewish or Italian. And while that's not like a big difference in the real world, within that kind of community, there were cliques and a sense of solidarity that we were kind of on the outside of. So while that was certainly not anywhere near the kind of divisions that you'd see in as I say the real world, it was a sense of isolation and a sense of outsiderness that at least made me feel, like I had to work harder to be accepted, and feeling that I was always going to be slightly outside and slightly different from the people that I was friends with or associated with. And then on top of that, I had my own family background, which was I grew up basically in the bunker household from All in the Family. So I was even amongst my family who were all good enough people. They were all fairly extreme conservative bigots, you know? And again, I guess maybe because of my kind of rebellious nature, I felt like an outsider among them, and it just reinforced my own sense of empathy and sympathy for people who were excluded from things. And I grew up, again in the '60s during the height of what was at the time the civil rights movement. I also became friends with a number of people in the early '70s who were gay, and believe me, as an Irish Catholic kid growing up, you would thought I would have been experienced with that from the priesthood, but I actually was completely naive, and just basically accepted them as people who were like me. We were all geeky comic book fans and science fiction fans. So I just sort of, I think it just became part of my personality to automatically side with minorities, with people who were, being considered outsiders or being treated as unequal, or it's just, it's so much a part of my makeup that I can't I can't even consider it any other way. It's just how I respond. I'm, what can I say?
So you were actually one of the first mainstream writers to have a conversation about equality and privilege.
Mhm.
Was there editorial pushback at Marvel when you started doing that?
One of the real weird differences that's so hard for people today to recognize about the comic book business, say in the late 60s, early 70s, was that because it was such a hugely transformative period of time creatively and economically, because the business was in crisis, there was not a lot of oversight. I mean, part of it was that the at least at Marvel, there was not a strong editorial presence other than the notion of what a Marvel comic should be. It should be something that's explosive, fun, character oriented, colorful. But there weren't a lot of do's and don'ts, which was part of the reason that people were able to take characters in directions that were unexpected. So there was not a lot of oversight there. And at DC, you had all these little fiefdoms of different editorial closets, basically, where this editor had 6 books and this editor had 6 books. And you might find friction with one of those editors, but there was no overall editorial policy pushing against any particular point of view. We were all subsumed to some degree by the Comics Code Authority, but that was more of a moral oversight in general than, say, a political or sociological viewpoint. If anything, there was a general sense of progressivism in the comic book editorial mindset, and there pretty much always had been. Comics comes out of a progressive ethos, starting back with Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster.
I just did this huge reread of Spider-Man comics. I bet you all. I bet like when you do these interviews, you get like a ton of Spider-Man questions because you were like, what, the second or third Spider-Man writer, just who had
I was
ever
the
done
second
it.
full-time writer. Yeah, the second. Roy Thomas did some fill-in issues, but I was the second full-time writer on the book.
So on the reread, the thing that I was noticing was how well the Gerry Conway stories hold up. And I was going through previous interviews that you did, and you said that the ones that hold up because you had the right instincts at the time. So I guess what the question is when you write, how do you know which instincts are the right instincts?
Well, that is a very good question. I mean, I think I trusted my instincts much more when I was younger than I do now, unfortunately. And I say that unfortunately because creativity comes from your instincts. It doesn't come from an intellectual approach, or from an educated approach of knowing what you can do and can't do, and so on. I've sometimes said that my superpower as a writer, as a young writer, was that I didn't know what I didn't know. And I had the arrogance and the confidence of adolescence, which, most adolescents believe that they're already grown up and they know everything they need to know, which of course isn't true. But it's a wonderful state of mind for creativity because it gives you a sense of empowerment and freedom to just push through the insecurities of that develop when you've experienced failure, and when you've experienced a letdown in your own skill set. If you don't have a sense of what you can't do, you'll try anything, and and maybe you'll succeed, and maybe you won't. But once you start developing that sense of skepticism about your own capabilities, which comes with experience, that can cut down on your creativity and your willingness to take chances. There's a couple of reasons why, if my stuff from that period holds up, it's because of the genuine enthusiasm that I had for writing the character, which it's hard to express it in terms other than giddiness, and the fact that I was writing about a character with whom I identified as a contemporary. So I understood Peter Parker because he and I had very similar backgrounds. Not, in the specifics, but, kind of in the emotional state of being young adults from the outer boroughs, trying to make their way in, the big city, dealing with the crises of youth, of ill parents, of misunderstood relationships. All of that stuff was completely part of my life. And in the writing of it, it was coming out honestly and sincerely. And that's what, if it has any staying power, that's why it does.
That is awesome. That's a great answer.
Thank you.
So, is there a formula that you developed over the years to write an effective comic book story?
I think so. I mean, I usually try uh, to have an emotional resonance with the characters that I'm writing about. Uh, that has to be the core of it. I have to have like some emotional statement that I'm trying to get across, even in something that's just a fight comic. Where you're basically going to have two characters beating each other up because that's what it's going to be. There has to be an emotional undercurrent to that I can relate to. And if I can relate to it, then I believe the reader can relate to it. Secondly, I mean, there are formulaic ways to approach structuring a story. I usually try to start with, some image that's in my head that I will become like the core image for the issue or the story that I'm working on. And then I either start with that as the beginning or the end or the middle of the story, and basing where it's going to fall in the middle of the story, everything else sort of takes on a shape around that. Each story feels different to me as I'm writing it, but there is the classic structure of introduction to the problem, complication of the problem, crisis of the problem, resolution of the problem, aftermath of the problem. And whether that occurs in one story or over a sequence of stories, depends upon what type of story I'm telling.
Do you have a favorite type of story to tell?
Um, Probably the answer is not really. I certainly enjoy telling stories that derive from a character conflict between two people who are trying to do the right thing as they see it, and how that can develop into a crisis. But within that, there's the mystery story where you're solving a mystery. There's the horror story where you're confronting a horror, and trying to discover the origin or how to defeat it. There's the spectacle superhero story. There's the science fiction story. I mean, they're all different stories, but ultimately it has to boil down to a conflict between individuals. And I think that's my favorite kind of story to tell. Sometimes it's a conflict between an individual and himself, an internal conflict that a character has to overcome. Those are fairly important stories to me. I did a story a few years back, more than a few years back now, The Last Days of Animal Man, which was based around the idea of what happens to a superhero as they get older and their powers diminish, which is sort of a story I related to at the time because I was in my mid 50s and I wasn't a kid anymore. And my abilities and my endurance for certain things was just not what it had been. And how do you come to terms with that? And I thought it would be interesting to put that into superhero terms. What would it be like if you're a superhero and you've always been able to do certain things, and now you couldn't do them the way that you had? How do you redefine yourself for that part of your life? To my mind, that hadn't really been done, as far as I was aware, for a superhero. And I thought that would make for an interesting story. And that's like an internal crisis, an internal conflict.
That's awesome. One area where your stories just really shine, I think, is in the unique voices of the characters. And the spot I think of when I think about this is Firestorm. The character not only has one voice, but you've got two voices
Yes.
at the same time that are just sort of at odds with each other. How do characters find their voices in your stories?
Well, I think every writer will tell you that at some level, each character is an aspect of themselves, or perhaps an interpretation of someone that they know. In the case of Firestorm, what I was trying to go for was, and inadvertently I thought kind of hit a home run with, was creating an archetype that, in the similar way that the early Spider-Man was a archetype of the adolescent struggling with, the problems of adult power, coming to an immature mind. I wanted Firestorm to sort of represent the struggle for independence that adolescents go through with the adult voices in their head, the parental figure looking over your shoulder, judging what you're doing and commenting on it, which I think every adolescent to some degree experiences. Is that struggle to separate yourself from the expectations or the overview, that you inherit from the parents in your life, or the adults in your life. So that seemed for me, that actually came to me fairly simply and directly, because I have always had that voice of the critical parent in my head, and I've always struggled with it. So, Ronnie Raymond struggling with the voice of Professor Stein, that certainly felt familiar to me. And, to the extent that that character has any validity as a character, I think it derives from that archetype. And to the extent that it reached, an audience that was receptive to it, it was because I was expressing sincerely my own internal struggle, through these characters. And that's what you do when you create a voice for a character, is that hopefully you're creating a voice that's speaking some truth that you understand, even if it's a truth that you don't agree with. Sometimes that's why writing villains can be very rewarding, because you're speaking perhaps from the dark side of your own personality, the side of yourself that you struggle with to be a better person. Those parts of yourself that aren't that nice, but are still a true part of yourself. So there you go. Comics tends to be reductive, and simplify things in a way that, say, mainstream literature can't. That's the value that comics have, is that it can bring clarity to certain kinds of serious struggles, internal struggles that are kind of made less clear by the mature observations of literature.
Yeah, totally.
It's not useful. I mean, I find it as a reader, very interesting to read complex characters with moral gray tones and so on in some of the literature that I read. But to be honest, for a younger reader, or even for most of us, on a casual basis, we want some kind of moral clarity and some kind of definitional clarity that, say, modern fiction doesn't provide.
Speaking of clarity, did you ever, in a million years, imagine that people would take the Punisher seriously as a character?
No, well, or maybe take him seriously as a character, but not take him as a role model. That way. I mean, there's a difference between taking a character seriously. I mean, you can take the Punisher seriously and even empathize with him, but recognize that what he is warning rather than a model. He's a sign of social failure he's a sad person in a lot of ways. He's got nothing, other than this very destructive approach to solving his inner conflict. And it's not helpful, But the idea that there would be people who would consider that a positive role model, that's kind of missing the point.
It seems like the Punisher's been openly adopted by military types and
Hmm.
right-wing crazies.
Yeah,
That was something I never expected as a kid
yeah.
reading Punisher comics.
Yeah, I mean, it's like anything else. He's a wish fulfillment in character, in all superhero characters, and all characters, even like Batman, who's not a superhero, they are wish fulfillments. But the smart writers are able to delineate the problematic aspects of those characters and bring out the social contradictions. But the truth is, a lot of people just prefer the wish fulfillment that Frank Castle represents of unrepentant and unrestrained revenge, let's say. I mean, the acting out of a power fantasy is probably too much for minds that prefer simple and uncomplicated and unreflective answers to complex problems, would prefer. It's probably not surprising, I mean, I think it's just an unfortunate aspect of our social times, that there are more people in those professions than there should be. I think it says less about Frank Castle and the Punisher that he's embraced by cops and military people and would-be militia types than it does about the institutions that allow those type of people to be part of them. I mean, what kind of screening process is a police institution doing that allows people who would embrace, what amounts to a vigilante to become a member of their institution? You know what I'm saying? I mean, it says less about the person who embraces it than it does about the institution that allows that person to be a part of it. How did you let that guy get in? you know, I mean, those guys are going to be out there, right? I mean, we're not going to get rid of potential fascists. That's a part of the human population. What my estimate is that 27% or 5% or 30% of Americans are potential fascists. They're delusional, they're racists, fantasists on some level, and that's just part of the population. It's just going to be there. It's just like 30% of the population is going to be people who are progressive, and another 40% are going to be in between. That's just what you got, right? But what does it say that an institution doesn't have the capability to keep those people out, or in fact wants those people in? That's the
Right.
problem. You'd have to ask yourself, why do we create institutions that embrace these kind of people?
So, what do you say to people who want to tell you that comics shouldn't be political?
It's saying you clearly haven't read any comics.
Thank you. That's what I tell them.
I mean, comics, Jesus Christ, they've been political since the very beginning. I mean, the earliest kinds of comics were political cartoons. I mean, Jesus, and even when you get into characters like Superman in his initial creation, was a character that clearly was a response to the privations and struggles of the Depression. You read the first 20 or 30 issues of Superman, and the primary villains are people like railroad barons and bankers and big city thugs, who are part of the political machine. I mean, it's total populist, anti-elites power and wish fulfillment. I mean, you can't get more New Dealish than the original Superman. And then even in the 50s, yes, he was political because he was political in an anti-communist sense. I mean, that's political. It might be a set of politics that those people who are criticizing him today would prefer, but it's still politics. you know? And when people say we don't want it to be political, what they really mean is we don't want you challenging my worldview. That's what it means. And that's always been what comics have done, because throughout their history, comics have been created by oppressed minorities. It's endemic to the business of comics. Because the way comics works, the kind of people who go into creating comics historically have been people who were outside of other potential mainstream occupations that would have been available to them if they were part of the economic elites. You don't become a writer of comics if you can write for Random House, or whatever the equivalent is. If you can write for much more lucrative fields, that's where you write, if you can. I mean, some people are born to write this kind of stuff, like me. It was always my preference to write fantasy and comic book stories. But realistically, a guy like me would have much more trouble breaking into the rarefied art world that would have been perceived as the legitimate world, of letters. But I had no trouble breaking into comics, except for the trouble of needing to meet the minimum requirements and to be lucky enough to be in the place and time when there was an opening. But it's always been a field of first generation immigrants, and in some cases, actual immigrants. It's a field for people who are oppressed, and the wish fulfillment aspects of it, are a reflection of that sense of oppression.
Was it difficult to make a living as a comic book writer?
Not as much as you might think. In my case, I was a prolific writer, and being prolific is, at least in the 70s, was the primary way that you made a living, because page rates were the only way that you earned money was by writing a page of comics. There were no royalties, there were no residuals, there were no extra benefits. So how many pages you wrote basically determined how much money you made. I was prolific and I was sufficiently professional that my work was well received and relatively successful for the two companies that I worked for in the 70s and 80s, that I could make a living by writing a lot. But if you weren't capable of writing a lot, it was tough. There were people who basically made just enough to pay their rent, and then there were people like me who made enough so that I could, live a relatively secure middle class life. And the same was true for different artists. There were artists who were prolific enough that they could make enough money to have a good, solid middle class life. All of that changed in the 90s. When you started getting superstar artists and rock star artists, and we started getting residuals, or royalties rather, and then there started to be potential income from outside projects and so on. Today, potentially, writers can live quite well, off their comic book writing, provided, of course, they're popular and successful. And artists, certainly can, again, provided that they're popular and successful. They can sell their art for high value. They can make additional money through commissions, and there's always the potential of royalties. And if you are a creator who can own your own material, there's literally no limit to the sky. It's certainly very different from what it was like in the 70s.
Now, you have worked, I think, with more iconic artists than anybody else I can think of. What does a good collaboration look like? How does it work?
Well, I think a good collaboration is like a good marriage or a good partnership in which two people bring complementary skills and viewpoints, where your goal is the same goal. You see things the same way. You're trying to achieve the same aims, and you're not pulling against each other. You're basically propping each other up. My strengths, support your weaknesses. Your strengths support my weaknesses. I've worked with so many incredibly talented artists over the years, in various kinds of collaborations where, we worked either basically co-creating the story together, or, where I've written a script and they've taken it and interpreted it. The successful ones are when we're of a single mind, or at least close enough so that we're seeing things the same way, so that we're not pushing against each other. I answered this recently on a Twitter thread. Somebody was asking me who are my favorite collaborators, and I mean, it's hard to pick any one person, but I'd say that the two most successful collaborations I've had were with Ross Andru on Spider-Man and the Spider-Man Superman crossover book, and Jose Garcia Lopez on multiple stories that we did together over the years. And they were very different kind of collaborations. With Ross, we would talk through a story, and sometimes I would actually write an outline, or sometimes he would just take notes and draw the story based on those notes. With Jose, I don't think we ever had a conversation except during the time that we collaborated creating the Atari Force. Most of the time, I would write a script and Jose would draw it. But for whatever reason, we thought about story structure and pacing and characters in the same way. And so what I wrote, recognizing how he was going to interpret it, it became almost perfect. It's like a perfect alignment of our approaches. So those are two very different collaboration styles, but they resulted in similar satisfying experiences for me. And I believe also for them, because that's at least what Jose has told me, and Ross seemed to enjoy working with me. So that would be my broadest answer to your question.
The other people that loom in the background of the creative process are the editors. Does the presence of an editor dramatically change the process of creating a comic?
Well, it depends on the editor. Some editors, want to be far more involved than others. In my view, the best editor is one who creates an atmosphere in which you can do your best work, and prods you to see when you're not reaching the goals that you've set for yourself. The worst editors are the ones who have their own agendas and want things to reflect their viewpoints, and their approach, how they think things should be, rather than trying to help you be, or the creator, the creator team, produce the best work that team can produce. So, it really depends upon the editor. I've worked with some terrific editors and some absolutely abysmal editors, and it's all about how they perceive their job and how good they were at creating the kind of environment where the people doing the work felt supported and enhanced. I've had editors, and by the way, it doesn't mean that they let me do whatever I want. Sometimes I can produce a storyline that I think is great, but it fails to do what I set out to do. And a good editor will point that out to me, and it could end up forcing me to completely rewrite what I was doing. And that could be all to the best, and that could be something that, so it's not about just giving me my head and my freedom. It's about helping me be the best creator that I can be.
There was an era at Marvel in the 70s where you're actually credited as the editor on a number of your own projects, including the first Miss Marvel comics. Is it challenging to edit your own work?
It certainly is. And I don't recommend it, as a process, because it's that was more like an extension of how things had been under Roy Thomas. When Roy was editing at Marvel, and even when Stan was editing at Marvel, both of them pretty much took a hands-off approach, simply because of the number of titles that were being produced. When Stan was editing, it simply was he was writing and editing all the books himself, so he didn't really, it wasn't an issue, and then when other writers would come in, Stan basically, and to his credit, I respected this about him. His attitude was, if I picked you to do the book, it's because I trusted you to do it, in a way that would fulfill my goals for the book. So go for it. But when Roy became an editor, while he was a bit more hands-on than Stan was, he was hampered by the fact that Marvel went from publishing 12 to 15 titles a month up to publishing 60 titles a month during his editorial era. And as a result, he had to let the writers basically become the editors of their own books. But he still provided supervision, by which I mean that he still read the books and would comment on them, sometimes make suggestions for rewrites, but usually after the art had been completed and the book was about to go to the printer. So mostly what he would do would become involved at the initial stage of the story and then at the final stage of the story. He didn't actually review outlines or review dialogue before it was lettered. He would just look at the book as a completed whole. But for someone who's, once Roy left, there was literally then no supervision over people who were credited as their own editors. And the result of that is that while it may work, there's also nobody to bounce ideas off of. There's nobody to tell you that's a stupid notion, or maybe you should try this instead of that, or that's great, but it would be even better. So it's kind of risky, and I don't think it's a good a good methodology to have writer editors or artist editors who do not have supervision above them. That being said, a lot of creators today, are over supervised, where they can't do anything without without several people above them putting their oar in, and that's really not useful. It doesn't help you to have 5 or 6 people, each with a different agenda and different perspective, offering their 2 cents and interfering with the creative process. After a certain point, that just becomes a mess, which is kind of the problem that DC had during the last 20 years. I would say.
Is the culture at DC dramatically different than the culture at Marvel?
Well, it's hard for me to say how it is right now, but historically, Marvel has been more cohesive in its approach to what makes for a good comic book, but allows, I think, more individual interpretation of what creators themselves want to do. So while the overall vision of what a Marvel comic book is fairly tight, individually, creators are allowed a bit more freedom of movement within that. At DC, there's far less cohesive vision of what a comic is, so that there are many different ways to approach a DC comic creatively. But there's far more individual interference in the creative process than there is, say, at Marvel. I mean, at Marvel, it's my belief, based on the experience that I've had there over the decades, that once you're given, the go-ahead on something, it's pretty much up to you how you're going to pursue it. At DC, at every stage, it seems like there's a bunch of different people putting in their own input on the work that you're doing without actually having a cohesive vision for what the company as a whole perceives to be a good DC comic. Do you understand the difference of what I'm saying?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So I think culturally that's the major difference. And partly that comes down to the way that the two companies created their heroes. At Marvel, almost the entire Marvel mythology was created by a handful of individuals working in close collaboration. Depending upon who you want to give the most credit to, you basically had Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, Don Heck as the creators of Marvel Comics. At DC, there's like there's so many different quote creators and so many different approaches to what makes a DC comic over the decades that there is no cohesive DC universe, let's say. You just can't wrangle it all together because it comes from so many different points of view, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. Both approaches have positives and negatives. It's just totally different cultural environments.
That's interesting. I don't think it's something people think about often, is just the culture behind the companies that create these.
Yeah. Well, we know that they're two different companies because their books do definitely feel differently, and both companies have their diehard fans, that will only read DC or only read Marvel and denigrate the other. But to me, it's like arguing the difference between R&B and rock and roll. Uh, it's a matter of taste, and you can like both of them. It's not an either or, but they do come from different cultural backgrounds. R&B comes from the black gospel tradition, and rock and roll comes from country uh, and bluegrass. It's their fundamental origin points are very different, but they both embrace similar structural and similar palettes. Uh, so it's just fascinating.
Oh, totally. It totally is. Oh, my friend, my buddy Bob Sodero, he has this autograph with, it's a John Romita autograph, but you signed it too, and it's got this sketch of Mary Jane on it. And it has her saying, "You did it, Jerry C." And then it has you with a little voice bubble in your signature, and it says, "And I'm glad I did." And I saw that, and I just cracked up. That was the coolest thing I've ever seen.
Well, you got to embrace it, right?
Totally. Okay, so in addition to doing comics, you have done a lot. I mean, a lot of television. You've done consulting, you've done writing, you've done all kinds of stuff. Was the change difficult to go from one medium to another?
It was probably less difficult than you might imagine, which is probably also why a lot of TV writers are now writing comics occasionally. They're both episodic storytelling. They're both kind of formulaic in genre, and in both cases, as a writer, you're usually writing in character voices that you did not create yourself. Um, so, when I was writing Spider-Man, I was while the voice that I was using was authentically speaking from my heart. The style in which the character spoke and the pacing and the verbal tics and so on were all created by Stan. So I was interpreting that character through my using my own experience, but I was writing a character that had been created by someone else. And the same thing is true when you're writing for TV. You're writing characters, unless you're the creator or showrunner, which is a rare occurrence. You're writing characters that someone else created the voice and personalities of. So in that sense, it's a skill set that overlaps. And then the episodic nature is also very similar, and it also helps that coming from comics, I was used to producing work on a deadline, that was immutable. The books had to go out every month, and you had to have a script done, and the artist had to have time to draw it, and so on. And the same was true with television writing. The major difference, is the stakes, the financial stakes between the two media.
Does television writing change more on the fly than comics does?
Probably, yeah, because there's more. There are more things that can happen and go wrong between the writing of the script and the final delivery of the product. If you've got a good artist working on a book, the odds that a scene won't play the way that you wrote it are fairly small, but there's so much that can go wrong in TV production. I mean, just from the fact that you're working on a financial budget that can constrain the choices, that you make in terms of setting, in terms of how many characters are involved in a scene, to how quickly the scene has to be shot. I mean, even a good director can end up screwing up a well-written scene just because of what happens on the day, and then that requires changes in editing when you're putting the scene together prior to finalizing the episode. Might require additional dialogue. All kinds of things can go wrong. A lot of that can't happen in a comic book, although it does. I mean, sometimes you get something where an artist completely botches a storytelling point. You have to write additional dialogue to make the point more clear, or it just gets missed by everybody and it goes out anyway. So, I mean, there's just many more opportunities because there's many more people involved in the process of of creating a television episode.
You're actually one of the few writers that's had a number of TV adaptations. I was just thinking about specifically Legends of Tomorrow. Half the cast is
Hmm.
characters that were created by Gerry Conway.
Well, that was true the first few years. Now they're mostly. I mean, I think there's only one left. Uh, yeah, but yeah, that's true. I mean, the first season or two, half of the characters were people I created. Same with Flash.
Mhm.
We had Vibe and Killer Frost. Were both my characters, or characters I co-created rather.
How's that feel when you see your characters on screen like that?
It's wonderful. There's. I mean, especially because it's something that was unexpected. I always knew that there was very little chance that these characters created in the 70s and 80s were ever going to see life in film, because it would have been almost impossible to do them. I mean, a character like Firestorm, there were no realistic options in special effects to make someone like him or Green Lantern, had similar powers, practical. And even in Legends, they didn't really do Firestorm's transmutation powers the way that he was written in the comics. So I guess aside from the fact that I was writing in the 70s and 80s at a time when comics were struggling to just stay alive on the newsstand, the idea that 40 years later that they'd have a presence in television just would have blown my mind.
Do you feel that the presence on television changes the books themselves in a positive way?
Yeah, I think. Well, I mean, I'm not sure that there's that much overlap between television viewers and comic book viewers, because comics are not friendly to the to people who discover those characters originally in other media. If you try reading a Superman comic today because you were a fan of, say, Superman versus Batman, you're going to be really confused. You're going to be very confused. And if you were a fan of Superman and Lois, the current TV show, again, you're going to be very confused when you pick up a Superman comic. And similarly with Spider-Man, if you like the Tom Holland Spider-Man, you are not going to have it's going to bewilder you to pick up Spider-Man as he's published today, because he's not a teenager. He's not
Sure.
a kid. He doesn't go to school. He doesn't have family problems. He's an adult running a business, or not. I mean, depending upon the writer. So it's hard to. I would think that the influence is simply to keep those comics around as source material, and that's good. There, like for example, my younger daughter is a big MCU fan, and she can't read the comics because there's nothing there that relates to what she's reading or what she enjoys about the MCU. I mean, literally nothing. So, uh, at least if you're a fan of some of the CW shows, there were the occasional CW variation comics. Like there'd be the Arrow comic that came out for a while that at least tried to tie into the Arrow universe. But there's I mean, you like Barry Allen on the Flash. You're not going to know what's going on in the Flash comic. It's like, who are these people?
Do you still have time to read comics?
Oh, I read them all the time. Yeah, I mean, I'm a big comic nerd. I'm currently reading. I mean, sometimes I read comics that are published now, but most of those that are my favorite of comics being published today are independent comics. The non superhero comics that come out from Image or Dark Horse or Boom Studios. I mean, just Dynamite. Those independents. I read occasionally. I mean, I'm a big Batman fan, so I read uh, Tom King's Batman and Jason Tyrion's Batman, and Scott Snyder's. I refer to the writers rather than the artists. Um, but what I really enjoy doing is going back and reading older comics. I'm currently rereading, and in some cases reading for the first time, New 52 comics. And that's been an experience because a lot of it is very incoherent. But it's also fun. Sometimes you come across a take on the characters that's really interesting because it's completely different from what you've seen before. So I enjoy that.
When was the last time a comic made you cry?
Oh, I don't think I'm not a crier,
Okay.
so it's really not. It's probably not a fair question in that sense. But I mean, there have been some that have moved me. Where I've felt like the storytellers really nailed it. Some of the Hellboy stories have really impressed me. As I say, the Tom King material on Batman, Brian Bendis on the original Spider-Man series that he did under the other label. I can't remember the other label.
Was that Ultimate?
Yeah, Ultimate. That's it. So there have been some books that have affected me as well done and fairly powerful.
Is there anybody that stands out in your mind as the most inspiring creator in comics?
Ah, well, I mean, from the past, I was inspired by people like Stan and Gardner Fox, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, Joe Kubert, Denny O'Neil, Neil Adams. Currently, I'm impressed by Mike Mignola, Tom King, as I said, Brian Buccicello, Francis Napol. I don't know how to pronounce some of their names, so I'm making a hash of it. Kelly Sue DeConnick, Matt Frackton. There are just so many talented people. I think there are many more talented creators working in the field today than there were at my generation. Simply because there's a broader acceptance of comics as a legitimate form. So more people are eager to use it to express themselves creatively. My generation, I think, was the first that seriously wanted to be doing comics. Because a lot of the guys that were working in comics were people who, prior to my generation, were people who felt like they had failed or were just simply, trying to make a living and not really inspired by the media itself. There were a handful of artists who really, really saw the potential of that media. But I'd say, good half of the people working at the time were people who really wanted to be doing something else, newspaper strips or illustration or writing novels or working in movies. they were they were people who felt like they had flunked, um, which was a shame because they had really achieved something tremendous, and a lot of them didn't see it, which was sad for those of us who chose it as a career path because of our love for
So, Gerry, we are coming up against the end of the show. Are you ready for the fun part?
it. I thought this was the fun part. I've been having fun.
It is. The whole thing is fun, but this is especially fun.
What is it?
The closing segment.
Okay.
All right. So, which Ninja Turtle do you see yourself as?
Which Ninja Turtle?
Mhm.
Well, I was not a big fan of it, so I probably don't have a specific. I'd say Michelangelo, or
There you go.
Donatello.
You strike me as a Donatello, for sure.
Donatello. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so if you had a Batman style utility belt and it was made of things that are relevant to your life,
Hmm.
what would be in it?
Iced coffee would be one of the biggies. I'm sure.
Nice.
I'd have
That's
that.
essential.
It's essential.
Hmm.
And I think probably my iPhone and my Kindle for reading comics would be part of it. My Kindle 10 would definitely be part of it.
What inspires you?
I'm inspired by the millennial generation, to be honest.
They're great
And
kids.
yeah, their willingness to address issues that my generation screwed things up on, or lost our way. Um, Things that Gen X has taken kind of for granted and accepted as inevitable. They are willing to call bullshit on, and I think that's very inspirational for me.
That's awesome. Do you have a set of criteria that you look for in a sidekick or minion?
They have to have a good sense of humor. That would be my one of my favorites. I mean, a willingness to watch a lot of older movies.
Nice. Nice. Like what kind of movies?
Oh, I like almost anything that was made in the 1960s and 50s, and noir films from the 40s.
Oh, so
Um,
good.
I'm a fan of junk movies, 60s and some 70s junk movies. Um, you know, what I find is that very often I'll watch a movie that I thought was terrific when I was a kid, and it's really not. Uh, so, but I still love it. That's kind of where I come from.
Where do you find joy?
I find joy in discovering new things,
Nice.
um, things that surprise me. Things that I didn't expect to see. Particularly, as I say, talking about comics or movies or books. Where someone approaches material that uh, should be old hat, and they find a way to make it fundamentally new and different. That gives me joy, because I like the idea that good things are still available. That there's still new things to be found and to be discovered, uh, and I like to discover them.
Nice. Congratulations, you've defeated Thanos. You now have the Infinity Gauntlet in your possession. I know you probably got a huge list of things you do with it, but what's the first thing you do with it?
Well, I snap my fingers and remove all Trump Republicans from the world. Bing, they're gone.
I think I would do something similar. Either that or reprogram them.
Yeah, well, I don't know if reprogramming is possible. I think they're defective at the source. I mean, a merciful elimination. Nothing too dramatic, and or maybe just transfer them to the universe that they think they're living in. So that would be good too.
I don't think they'd like it there, though.
Well, maybe they would. It's not my. It would no longer be my problem.
There you go. So what's next for the incomparable Gerry Conway?
Well, I honestly don't know. I in terms of immediate things that I'm doing, I'm hoping that I'll be getting back onto the convention circuit next year. And I'm hoping that the convention circuit itself will get back. It's been feeling this past year felt like a false start. And I was disappointed, especially, from the previous year of losing an opportunity to see a lot of people. But going back to a few conventions this summer just made me feel very, very uncomfortable. And I'm just hoping that, next year will be a better year for that. Because I like talking, as you can tell, and I like, meeting fans and chatting with them. And from a creative point of view, it's wide open. I have no immediate plans, but never say never.
Nice. Well, Gerry, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to pop on my humble little podcast and talk to me. This has been much fun.
Well, as it has been for me.
So where can people find you online?
I'm active on Twitter, and if you don't mind a mixture of pop culture references and highly progressive politics, you can find me at Gerry Conway.
And now it's time to go. Wasn't that fun? The Panel Garden is a show about the things we love. And if you're feeling super generous, feel free to go to buymeacoffee.com/EvaIsAdorable. There, you can support what we do by chipping in as little as $1. Not financially able? That's okay. Shares on social media and reviews on your favorite podcast listening platforms help us a ton. In any case, thanks for being awesome. The show is produced and hosted by the adorable Eva Webb. Opening theme by Antonia Marquis and Tyler Scott. Closing theme by Mikey Flash of Speed Force Music. The credits are read by the awesome and talented Kat Bertano. That's me. The Panel Garden is a production of Unicorn Fight Industries. Join us next time for another exciting adventure in cyberspace. See you then. Bye!